Okay, the purpose of this video is to cover a topic called factoring, and this is huge. It is critical that college algebra students understand this concept and how to do it. It is one of the most common questions or issues that we see college algebra students struggle with at the beginning of their college algebra course. And one of the reasons for that is because the majority, if not all, college algebra instructors expect their students to already know how to do this. And it is not an unrealistic expectation. The concept of factoring should have been taught in previous algebra courses. The issue becomes, how long ago did you have that algebra course? Do you remember what you learned? Or maybe you never really understood it the first go around. But either way, whatever your background is, I guarantee you that your instructor is going to expect you to know how to do this. And if you feel like factoring is not something that you're comfortable with, you need to brush up on this, or again, you will struggle throughout multiple sections of this course that rely on factoring as a technique to help you analyze different types of equations or functions. So the purpose of this video is to give you a general overview of what factoring is, why we do it, the different types of factoring, and then there'll be subsequent videos that break down and actually do examples of each type, and I'll explain that a little bit later in this video. So in general, let's highlight this. Factoring. This is what we are trying to cover in this video. What is it? It's basically finding what was multiplied together to get an expression. For example, a polynomial. So some of you may be familiar with a term called foiling. You may have taken two binomials and foiled them together to get a quadratic, let's say. Well, factoring is basically doing the opposite. It's taking that polynomial, like a quadratic, for example, and breaking it back down into its component parts. Why do we do it? It aids us in solving equations, whether we're trying to solve an equation for a specific value, or more often in this course, we're going to take that equation and set it equal to 0, and that allows us to go find x-intercepts or zeros of a function. That will mean more later. But again, the main point is it's very, very important. And so how do you do factoring? There is a process that is the best, in my opinion, the best approach to follow. And it is a 3-step process. So if you are an expert factorer, I guarantee you are doing these steps maybe inside of your head, and you become so good at it and so efficient at it that you don't even realize this is what you're doing anymore. They're critical. And so for the beginning student factoring, you may have to very proactively manage your thinking and very proactively go through these steps one at a time. Don't be in a rush. You want to train your brain to follow this process. And if you can do that, you'll become a very, very efficient factorer. Okay, so what are these 3 steps of general factoring? The first one is we need to place all the terms of our polynomial in descending order, okay? And I'll explain what that is in a second. Once we've done descending order, then we're going to look for something called a greatest common factor. And if there is one, we're going to factor it or pull it out front. And once we've done these first 2 steps, step 3 then says, okay, now what type of polynomial do I have? Is it a binomial, which means it has 2 terms? Is it a trinomial, which means it has 3 terms? Or is it a 4-term polynomial? Because depending on which one of these you have, you will follow a different process. And so, but again, some students, they want to jump straight to step 3. They look at it right away and go, oh, I have a binomial, let me do it this way, or I have a trinomial. But I want to encourage you, please do not do that, because you can make mistakes if you forget to do step 1 and step 2. So again, step 1, place it in descending order. Step 2, factor out a GCF if you can, and then step 3, what type do I have? And then you'll go follow that appropriate method. Okay, so what does descending order mean? Descending order means you want to take the terms and rearrange them if needed. The polynomial might already be given to you in descending order. If it is, then great. You don't have to do this, but you still need to check. Descending order says you want the highest power of the variable on down. So for example, this first one that I have here, negative 14x squared plus 4x to the 4th plus 6. If you look at these powers, those are all called exponents. You want to find the highest one, and that term would be listed first and then on down. So if I look at this first one, the 4, that's the highest power. So that entire term, the 4x to the 4th, that needs to be listed first, which is what I've done here. The 2, that's the next highest power. So this term would be listed second, and notice this negative sign goes with this 14, so I took this entire term and listed it second. And then finally, this is just a coefficient. It doesn't have a variable, and it actually does. It's called x to the 0, and when we have a variable to a 0, that's actually just a 1, and so 0 would be the power there, which would be the lowest power, and it is listed last. So if you follow that same approach, you should be able to successfully rearrange these next two examples in descending order as well. So again, this is the first step of factoring. Please make sure your polynomial is in descending order. Again, it might be given to you that way. If it is, great, you're ready to move to step 2. If it's not, then you need to proactively do that on your own, and then we will go to step 2. So step 2 talks about pulling out, is a phrase sometimes we use, the GCF, or greatest common factor. Now, what that means is, as you look at all of these terms in this polynomial, right here, what do they have in common? A greatest common factor could have a number, it could have a letter, it could have both. It just depends on each unique polynomial. And so if you look at this, if you look at these numbers, I have a 3, a 9, and a negative 6. There is a common factor there. If you assess that, the number 3 would divide evenly into each of these numbers. So a 3 in essence could be divided or pulled out. But also, because each term has an x, we also could pull out an x. This again is x to the 1st. So this one is x cubed, and then x squared, and then x. X to the 1st, that's the smallest power, so that's the only amount I'm going to be able to pull out. So if you look at this polynomial, the greatest common factor would have a 3 and an x, and we are going to pull it out front. Think of it as dividing each one of these terms by the 3x, and then what gets left behind I would include inside of those parentheses. Once you identify the GCF, if factoring or pulling it out is something you struggle with, you may need to go back and review a video on doing that. But again, the important piece is, does it have a GCF? If it does, you need to pull it out front. Sometimes they don't. There's nothing to pull out. But if there is, you need to do that first. And then that will enable you to go to step 3, which says what's left. And what I mean by what's left, I mean if you pulled out a GCF, what is left in parentheses there. In this course, for the most part, you're going to have 3 types of things that are left. It's either going to be a binomial, which means there are 2 terms, or a trinomial, which means there are 3. This would be an example of a trinomial. I see 1, 2, 3 terms there. Or it may have 4 terms. And depending on which type it is, that will dictate what you go and do next. So for example, in this sheet, if it's a binomial, we cover that in this first letter A. When you are factoring binomials, those are formulas. You literally follow a formula to do that, and you may have to memorize these formulas. They're not that complicated, and again, I'm going to do a video specifically on factoring binomials. But anyway, 2 terms, binomial, we're going to use a formula. Maybe what you have is a trinomial. That means it has 3 terms. When you factor trinomials, there are actually quite a few different methods that are used. If you have done this previously, you may have a preferred method. Here's just a few. There's a method called AC method. There's a method called trial and error. You could use the quadratic formula. You could use complete the square, and this only kind of touches the surface. There are a lot of ways to factor trinomials. I personally prefer the AC method because it's very straightforward, and it really focuses students to learn a process. And when you learn this process, you will just become very efficient at factoring these trinomials. Students that are very good at factoring probably are doing trial and error in their head, and that's great too if you're able to do that. But a lot of students, especially beginners, can't do this, and the AC becomes a really good sound approach. The third type of polynomial you can have is something I would just call a four-term polynomial. And what that literally means is, here are a few examples. You have a polynomial and there are four terms. When that's the case, we try this method called grouping. And when you're first learning how to factor, if you have four terms, they usually group because they want you to learn that method. But as you progress through your college algebra course, in particular when you get to the study of nth degree polynomials, you may have some polynomials that are four terms that when you try to group, they don't. It actually doesn't work. And then you move to this tool called synthetic division, and you learn that later in the course. For now, when we're talking about factoring, let's assume you've got a four term, and let's assume we're gonna try to group it and it's gonna work. So I know this seems like a lot to remember, but it's very important. If you want to become efficient and effective at factoring, I highly encourage you to follow this three-step process. And again, to stress what I mentioned in the beginning, the majority, if not all, college algebra instructors are going to assume that you already know how to do this. This sheet, I want to point out to you where you can find it. So let me close out this document camera. And I'm going to just move that over here. Some of you, if you don't recognize this, hopefully you will soon. This is the main Metropolitan Community College web page. So if you just go, you can go to mcckc.edu. So mcckc.edu. If you go out to that site, this is what will show up. You want to click on the current students tab, and then let me kind of scroll down. So when you're in current students, please click on this button called tutoring. When you click on tutoring, over here to the left, each of the campuses that we have as a part of our MCC community populate. I am affiliated with the Blue River campus, and so if you click on Blue River and then head to the math lab, you will have a whole series of handouts and worksheets at your disposal. So there are links to a ton of algebra concepts. And they're kind of organized by topics. So we have a lot of algebra handouts here, basic math, calculus, etc. Let me go down because we actually have an entire section called factoring. So if you go down to this factoring piece, this first link is called factoring. It will take you to that sheet that I was just referring to, so you could print that off if you would like to. As I mentioned before, there are several different methods that are employed for factoring trinomials, and we have some of those sheets here as well. Again, just to go down a little bit further, we've got handouts on graphing, polynomials, I mean, all kinds of stuff. So as you're progressing through this course, if you are curious about whether we have a handout on something, there's a great chance we do. And if you get familiar with this website, you can find a lot of great stuff. So again, let me go down and I will actually click on that link. So you can see this is the sheet that I was just referring to, and it's out here for you to access and print it off if you would like. Okay, so let me close this down, go back to the document camera. Okay, so again, factoring, very, very important. You need to know how to do this or you are going to end up probably experiencing a lot of frustration. Please consider this three-step process. Number one, when you have a polynomial, make sure it's in descending order. Get in the habit of doing that first. Number two, can you pull out a GCF? If you can, do it. If you can't, then you can't, but at least you checked. And then finally, once you've done that, if you've pulled out a GCF or not, maybe this was my beginning problem that I had. What is it? Is it a binomial, a trinomial, or a four-way? And then depending on which one of those it is, you will go follow a specific approach. And there are subsequent videos on each one of those. So if you don't know how to do any of this, I would encourage you to watch all 3 videos. If you feel like, hey, I know how to do the binomials, it's the trinomials I struggle with, then just go watch the trinomial video. So you're going to have to assess yourself and figure out where you really are at, and then go watch the applicable videos so you can make sure that your factoring skills are where you need them so that you can be successful in your college algebra class.